Today we're going to be checking out God of War on the new ROG Ally X. If you're new here, we're going to go through all the settings. Low, medium, high, ultra. I'm going to start things off in 900p, but we'll also test some 1080p and a little 720p and see how much we can get out of this device. That's it. Thank you so much for being here. Make sure to subscribe, hit that thumbs up, and leave me a comment with some games that you would like me to test on the Steam Deck or the ROG Ally X. Without any further delay, let's jump in. First off, we're gonna make sure that all of our settings are correct. We're gonna start things off with the 30 watt plugged into power ultra mode on the ROG Ally X. 900p, 120 hertz, CPU boost off, 30 watts. Everything looks good. Now we can jump into the in-game settings. 900p, VSync is off, 120 frames per second, and then the resolution scaling is off. We're just not going to use that in this test because later we're going to test out AMD's Fluid Motion Frame Generator. I installed the new version 2 and it's amazing. So it's more like having FSR 3, and we don't have FSR 3 as an option. So I'm just not even going to use this, and we'll test out AFMF 2 in this test later. But for now, none of that stuff. Just straight up 900p. We'll start things off in low settings. All right, starting things off nice and easy inside low settings, 900p, and we're dancing with the 60 to mid 60 frames per second, but we are inside. So we got to get ourselves out into the open world here in a tiny little crammed area. 65 frames per second, 900p, amazing. This is what we want to see. However, we need to get outside into the real world and see what kind of performance we're actually going to be getting here. As we step into the real world, we dip 10 frames per second. Now we're getting around 50 frames per second out here, which is not too bad, but I would love to see these games playing natively 900p at 60 frames per second, as this is already becoming a little bit of an older AAA title. Mind you, a beautifully crafted, the graphics are amazing, so it's definitely not lacking in the looks, but it looks like outside, we're going to be getting around 50 frames per second. It keeps dipping a little bit into the 40s, but very high 40s. So overall, not bad with no help of FSR or any frame generation software. Now we can jump in, change things to what they call original, which is basically medium. All right, these original medium settings, 900p,
hey, Brock,
the 30 watt power is staying above 40 frames per second, which is not terrible. It almost wants to go into the 50s, and I'm sure if we went inside somewhere, it would easily be getting 50 frames per second. But it's staying over 40 at these original settings. To be honest, this might be what I would play at if I was super opposed to using FSR or any frame boost software, but we'll get into that later. And honestly, I'm always going to be using that on games like this. Yeah, it looks to be a solid above 40, mid 45, typically hanging out there in the mid 40s. Not bad. So we can jump in, change our settings to high. Now we're treading in some dangerous waters. Let's see if we can stay above 30 frames per second at high settings. I don't want to speak too soon, but we're staying in the mid 30 frames per second at high settings. So if you wanted more of a console experience here, you could plug into your dock, get on your TV, and play this and be getting over 30 frames per second. Now that we're inside, it's at 40 frames per second. And there's a lot of this game that happens inside dungeons like this. So a big chunk of your experience would be this. But if we wander back outside, it does take a big dip, but thankfully, staying above 30 frames per second. I'm sure if we ran into a horde of bad guys, this could potentially dip under 30 frames per second. But you gotta remember, we're not using FSR at all right now.
What's that over there?
The Viture PRO XR glasses are the way to go. 1080p, 120 hertz, super bright, and if you buy them, use my code Joshua Gray, and you'll get 10% off all the accessories. And I get a kickback, which helps me make more of these types of videos. And now back to our program. High settings, 30 to 40 frames per second, not too bad. Let's jump in and change the settings to ultra. I have a feeling with no assist from FSR or fluid motion, this is going to be challenging for this little device. Honestly, it's really trying to stay at that 30 frames per second, even outside here, but it is feeling a little bit chunky right now. Yeah, there we go, 24. That's what it feels like. It feels like it's doing mid-20s. Ultra settings, 900p, with nothing helping it. It's almost able to do this at the plugged-in 30-watt power, but just not quite there. If we're inside, it's a different story. It looks like we would be able to play this at Ultra. I think it would be such a great idea for game developers to create a scenario where they map out demanding areas of the game and less demanding areas of the game, and it would auto switch your settings. So you could be like, hey, when I'm inside somewhere where it's not as demanding, automatically switch to Ultra. And when I'm outside in the real world, switch it to medium. And if it could just automatically switch back and forth for you and keep a more seamless experience, I think that would be really awesome. Now we're gonna turn on AMD Fluid Motion Frames 2. This isn't officially released yet, but version 2 compared to 1 is so much better. We're gonna have high and performance mode, and anti-lag is also enabled. I'm gonna switch over to the performance tracking on AMD software. So it'll pull up over here now instead of this bar on the top, and we're actually gonna turn that one off. And you can see here, frame gen lag is on, which means it is working successfully. 23 is a little higher than I would love to see it, but it's not bad. Sometimes, like in the first version, you'd be getting over 50, which that was pretty unusable. So we're still at that 900p ultra settings. All we have done is turned on AMD's fluid motion generator, and now we're gonna see the magic of this, which right away I can totally tell the difference here. But you can also see that massive ghosting. His head's like doubling. So when you're moving really quickly, this game is having a pretty massive ghosting effect. But this is at ultra settings, so we're not really getting enough frames for it to be building frames in between. But this is definitely playing a lot smoother feeling than it was just a moment ago. But again, not really recommended to be playing a game that can't even play 30 frames per second and then try to use software that's just generating frames in between. But you know, this is like trying to tell us that we're getting 55 frames per second, and it absolutely is playing smoother and looks better than it was without it on, but at the cost of some weird ghosting a little bit and a couple other things. So I don't think I'd be doing this at Ultra, so let's jump in and change to high. I actually have a pretty good feeling about playing this at high settings with Fluid Motion 2 on. I really want this to stay above 60 frames per second. Right away, it is feeling way better. Really holding strong above 60 frames per second. As we go inside, it's gonna have even better opportunities to show off, yeah, 70 frames per second. And it really is feeling like that. Other than, again, we definitely have a little bit around his head still when you're spinning. But on a game like this, it's not a first-person shooter, and a lot of those little things don't bother me that much. And on a little screen, it's a little more forgiving. And so I'm a huge fan of using this Fluid Motion Gen 2. The first gen, no. This second one, huge improvement. I've been playing Elden Ring a lot and having an amazing experience. But yeah, at high settings, we're pretty consistently staying above 60 frames per second now, which is amazing. This is what we would all want out of a handheld, to be able to play these games at over 60 frames per second. So now let's jump to medium settings, which they call original. This will be our medium setting. Inside, we're getting a nice solid 80 to 88, 90 frames per second. And now it's looking way better. Significantly less ghosting around his head as we spin. This technology only works better the more frames that you're natively getting, because then it's not trying so hard to like shove in these fake frames in between. When you already have, you know, 45, 60 frames per second, that's where this shines. So playing games, you know, at 900p medium settings and kicking this on, a lot of the AAA games are showing results like this, which feel incredible. And it's really making me love the Ally X. 90 frames per second! And it looks so good. Let's switch, going all the way to low settings. 900p, low settings, AMD fluid motion generation, and we're getting 100 frames per second. I want to run back out here before I go inside, see if we can maintain that 100 frames per second. Oh yeah, this is what we like to see. And this game still looks incredible at low setting. Okay, now we're gonna run inside and see what we're getting. Imagine if we could get 120 frames per second. Dang. 110, 111, 105. Even still, a little bit of that ghosting action. I don't even know if that's ghosting. What would you call that? Help me out in the comment. Wow, it's barely, maybe not. Okay, I think what I want to do is work our way backwards now. I'm going to keep all these settings, low and fluid motion on, but we're going to change TDP 17, the performance mode, and unplug this bad boy. So we're still in low settings, frame generation is on, we've just unplugged and are now at that 17 watt. Still getting 110 frames. I mean, this honestly only lost us like 1 or 2 frames. With the giant battery inside this handheld, playing these games at the performance 17 watt profile is absolutely a usable use case. I've been doing it all the time. I even jump into turbo because a lot of the times I'm not playing for over an hour anyways, and you can definitely get over an hour in the top handheld power profiles. But look at this, we are still getting 90 frames per second out here in the real world, just running around. It honestly doesn't seem like we lost any performance jumping down. Let's jump in and go to high.
I see stuff on the other side.
All right, high settings, 900p, 17 watt. We're getting above 50 frames per second, but it is looking a little choppy. Just like a tiny bit, but this does seem to be making a little bit of a difference compared to the 30 watt, just in terms of smoothness. When we come inside, it disappears. Now it looks like we're playing at 60 frames per second. It looks fantastic.
I'm not sure what you're doing.
Just chilling at that mid 50 frames per second here. Now let's jump in, get crazy, go to ultra on this 17 watt power profile. It's staying in the mid 40s, high 40s, which is pretty great. It's probably hard to tell through the camera, but it is a little choppy. So I'm not sure that this would be the settings that I would use. Honestly, at low, getting that 100 frames per second is where I'd probably chill and play this. Okay, so that's everything at 900p. Now it's time to jump in, increase to 1080p. We'll stay at that 17 watt for now. Now we're at 1080p, still no resolution scaling going on. We do have fluid motion happening here in the corner, and we can know that it's on because of that frame gen lag. We'll jump all the way down to low, give this a little better chance with its life. Okay, so now we're playing this game at the native resolution of this device, low settings, 17 watt power profile, and we're chilling above 60 frames per second, which is good to see. Inside, we get a massive 10 frames per second, 15 frames per second boost, giving ourselves a high 70 frames per second. This is probably the settings I'd use. I'd just lock in at 1080p, low settings, and enjoy my life. All right, now we'll try out high settings. We'll give it a second to figure out its life. It's looking pretty good. 1080p, native resolution, high settings. We're looking at a mid 40 frames per second. And the moment we walk in here, we're gonna be getting some real tasty frames per second. Oh, I was really hoping for 60. Mid, right there at 55, but it dips down to the high 40s even inside. So at this 17 watt power profile, it's struggling a little bit to play this at high native resolution, even with the fluid motions on, which makes me want to know if we boost it to, is it going to perform much better? Kicking onto turbo is helping just push it almost to that 60 frames per second, 1080p, high settings. So if you're in a pinch and you want the quality and you don't need a ton of battery life, just kick it into turbo mode and enjoy high settings at native 1080p, and you are almost experiencing a 60 frames per second.
Wish we could break that chain.
It definitely helps going from the 17 watt profile to the 25 turbo. Now it's maintaining 50s to 60 frames per second, which is a lot nicer than what we were just getting. And again, this has an 80 watt hour battery, so even playing in turbo mode, you still get plenty of time. I'm not typically, having a 3-4 hour gaming session. I'm just gaming for like maybe an hour at a time. So most of the time, I'm in turbo mode because I'm just gonna plug this in after I'm done. But yeah, inside we're getting 60 to mid 60 frames per second. Outside we're getting high 50s. So that certainly helped. The last thing I want to see, pushing this thing to its max. So dropping to 720p, plugging in and jumping over to the fully maxed out 30 watt profile, bringing the graphics all the way to low. Before I get ahead of myself, we are seeing an incredible improvement going to 720p. We're at like 130 plus frames per second, and we're outside. When we go inside, it's already jumping up 150. Oh my gosh. Honestly, the 720p from 900p is not making that huge of a difference. 170 frames per second. This is ridiculous. I take back everything I said. I would just play this at 720p. This looks awesome. On a handheld, playing a AAA title at 120 frames per second. Something that we're going to test here in 1 second is also using the upscaler in AMD's software, which also works really great. So let's do that. So we should be able to just enable this and it will upscale the 720. So it says right there, active, 720 to 1080p. Yeah, this is definitely how I'd play it. 720 upscale to 1080p, AMD's Fluid Motion version 2 performance, low settings. This looks incredible. And we're almost just maintaining 120 frames per second. We're above 110 for almost everything. Yeah, that's a noticeable difference in frame rate. To be able to take this on your TV, upscale to 1080p, you could even probably upscale this to 4K from 1080p. But if you want this 120, 720p, upscale it to 1080, and enjoy this game at over 100 frames per second. But in a handheld mode, it's even more ridiculous to be able to just have this lay in your bed and play at 120 frames per second, and it looks like this. We just recently passed 5,000 subscribers, guys. Pew, 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 pew. But now we are on the march for 10,000 subscribers. Make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and hit that thumbs up, and I will see you in the next one.